Most of the writing of security analysts on formal appraisals relates to the valuation of growth stocks. Our study of the various methods has led us to suggest a foreshortened and quite simple formula for the valuation of growth stocks, which is intended to produce figures fairly close to those resulting from the more refined mathematical calculations. Our formula is value equals current normal earnings 8.5 plus Y's. The expected annual growth rate. The growth figure should be that expected over the next 7 to 10 years. 7. We show how our formula works out for various rates of assumed growth. It is easy to make the converse calculation and to determine what rate of growth is anticipated by the current market price, assuming our formula is valid. In our last edition we made that calculation for the Dow Jones Industrial Average and for 6 important stock issues. These figures are reproduced in Table 11.5. We commented at the time. The difference between the implicit 32.4% annual growth rate for Xerox and the extremely modest 2.8% for General Motors is indeed striking. It is explainable in part by the stock market's feeling that General Motors' 1963 earnings, the largest for any corporation in history, can be maintained with difficulty and exceeded only modestly at best. The price-earnings ratio of Xerox, on the other hand, is quite representative of speculative enthusiasm fastened upon a company of great achievement and perhaps still greater promise. The implicit or expected growth rate of 5.1% for the Dow Jones Industrial Average (BC) pairs with an actual annual increase of 3.4%, compounded, between 1951 to 1953 and 1961 to 1963. We should have added a caution somewhat as follows: the valuations of expected high growth stocks aren't, according to the arithmetic, if a company could be assumed to grow at a rate of 8% or more indefinitely in the future, its value would be infinite, and no price would be too high to pay for the shares. What the valuer actually does in these cases is to introduce a margin of safety into his calculations, somewhat as an engineer does in his specifications for a structure. On this basis the purchasers would realize his assigned objective, in 1963, a future overall return of 71/2% per annum, even if the growth rate actually realized proved substantially less than that projected in the formula. Of course, then, if that rate were actually realized, the investor would be sure to enjoy a handsome additional return. There is really no way of valuing a high-growth company, with an expected rate above, say, 8% annually, in which the analyst can make realistic assumptions of both the proper multiplier for the current earnings and the expectable multiplier for the future earnings. As it happened, the actual growth for Xerox and IBM proved very close to the high rates implied from our formula. As just explained, this fine showing inevitably produced a large advance in the price of both issues. The growth of the Dow Jones Industrial Average itself was also about as projected by the 1963 closing market price. But the moderate rate of 5% did not involve the mathematical dilemma of Xerox and IBM. It turned out that the 23% price rise to the end of 1970, plus the 28% in aggregate dividend return received, gave not far from the 71/2% annual overall gain posited in our formula. In the case of the other 4 companies, it may suffice to say that their growth did not equal the expectations implied in the 1963 price and that their quotations failed to rise as much as the Dow Jones Industrial Average. Warning: this material is supplied for illustrative purposes only, and because of the inescapable necessity in security analysis to project the future growth rate for most companies studied. Let the reader not be misled into thinking that such projections have any high degree of reliability or, conversely, that future prices can be counted on to behave accordingly as the prophecies are realized, surpassed, or disappointed. We should point out that any scientific, or at least reasonably dependable, stock evaluation based on anticipated future results must take future interest rates into account. A given schedule of expected earnings, or dividends, would have a smaller present value if we assume a higher than if we assume a lower interest structure. Such assumptions have always been difficult to make with any degree of confidence, and the recent violent swings in long-term interest rates render forecasts of this sort almost presumptuous. Hence we have retained our old formula above, simply because no new one would appear more plausible. Industry analysis. Because the general prospects of the enterprise carry major weight in the establishment of market prices, it is natural for the security analyst to devote a great deal of attention to the economic position of the industry and of the individual company in its industry. Studies of this kind can go into unlimited detail. They are sometimes productive of valuable insights into important factors that will be operative in the future and are insufficiently appreciated by the current market. Where a conclusion of that kind can be drawn with a fair degree of confidence, it affords a sound basis for investment decisions. Our own observation, however, leads us to minimize somewhat the practical value of most of the industry studies that are made available to investors. The material developed is ordinarily of a kind with which the public is already fairly familiar and that has already exerted considerable influence on market quotations. Rarely does one find a brokerage house study that points out, with a convincing array of facts, that a popular industry is heading for a fall or that an unpopular one is due to prosper. Wall Street's view of the longer future is notoriously fallible, and this necessarily applies to that important part of its investigations which is directed toward the forecasting of the course of profits in various industries. We must recognize, however, that the rapid and pervasive growth of technology in recent years is not without major effect on the attitude and the labors of the security analyst. More so than in the past, the progress or retrogression of the typical company in the coming decade may depend on its relation to new products and new processes, which the analyst may have a chance to study and evaluate in advance. Thus there is doubtless a promising area for effective work by the analyst, based on field trips, interviews with research men, and on intensive technological investigation on his own. There are hazards connected with investment conclusions derived chiefly from such glimpses into the future, and not supported by presently demonstrable value. Yet there are perhaps equal hazards in sticking closely to the limits of value set by sober calculations resting on actual results. The investor cannot have it both ways. He can be imaginative and play for the big profits that are the reward for vision proved sound by the event, but then he must run a substantial risk of major or minor miscalculation. Or he can be conservative, and refuse to pay more than a minor premium for possibilities as yet unproved, but in that case he must be prepared for the later contemplation of golden opportunities foregone. A two-part appraisal process. Let us return for a moment to the idea of valuation or appraisal of a common stock, which we began to discuss above on p. 288. A great deal of reflection on the subject has led us to conclude that this better be done quite differently than is now the established practice. We suggest that analysts work out first what we call the past performance value, which is based solely on the past record. This would indicate what the stock would be worth, absolutely, or as a percentage of the Dow Jones Industrial Average or of the S&P Composite, if it is assumed that its relative past performance will continue unchanged in the future. This includes the assumption that its relative growth rate, as shown in the last 7 years, will also continue unchanged over the next 7 years. This process could be carried out mechanically by applying a formula that gives individual weights to past figures for profitability, stability, and growth, and also for current financial condition. The second part of the analysis should consider to what extent the value based solely on past performance should be modified because of new conditions expected in the future. Such a procedure would divide the work between senior and junior analysts as follows. 1. The senior analyst would set up the formula to apply to all companies generally for determining past performance value. 2. The junior analysts would work up such factors for the designated companies, pretty much in mechanical fashion. 3. The senior analyst would then determine to what extent a company's performance, absolute or relative, is likely to differ from its past record, and what change should be made in the value to reflect such anticipated changes. It would be best if the senior analyst's report showed both the original valuation and the modified one, with his reasons for the change. Is a job of this kind worth doing? Our answer is in the affirmative, but our reasons may appear somewhat cynical to the reader. We doubt whether the valuations so reached will prove sufficiently dependable in the case of the typical industrial company, great or small. We shall illustrate the difficulties of this job in our Discus Sign of Aluminium Company of America, Alcoa, in the next chapter. Nonetheless, it should be done for such common stocks. Why? First, many security analysts are bound to make current or projected valuations, as part of their daily work. The method we propose should be an improvement on those generally followed today. Secondly, because it should give useful experience and insight to the analysts who practice this method. Thirdly, because work of this kind could produce an invaluable body of recorded experience, as has long been the case in medicine, that may lead to better methods of procedure and a useful knowledge of its possibilities and limitations. The public utility stocks might well prove an important area in which this approach will show real pragmatic value. Eventually, the intelligent analyst will confine himself to those groups in which the future appears reasonably predictable, or where the margin of safety of past performance value over current price is so large that he can take his chances on future variations, as he does in selecting well-secured senior securities. In subsequent chapters we shall supply concrete examples of the application of analytical techniques. But they will only be illustrations. If the reader finds the subject interesting, he should pursue it systematically and thoroughly before he considers himself qualified to pass a final buy or sell judgment of his own on a security issue. These industry groups, ideally, would not be overly dependent on such unforeseeable factors as fluctuating interest rates or the future direction of prices for raw materials like oil or metals. Possibilities might be industries like gaming, cosmetics, alcoholic beverages, nursing homes, or waste management. Chapter 12. Things to consider about per share earnings. This chapter will begin with two pieces of advice to the investor that cannot avoid being contradictory in their implications. The first is, don't take a single year's earnings seriously. The second is, if you do pay attention to short-term earnings, look out for booby traps in the per share figures. If our first warning were followed strictly, the second would be unnecessary. But it is too much to expect that most shareholders can relate all their common stock decisions to the long-term record and the long-term prospects. The quarterly figures, and especially the annual figures, receive major attention in financial circles, and this emphasis can hardly fail to have its impact on the investor's thinking. He may well need some education in this area, for it abounds in misleading possibilities. As this chapter is being written, the earnings report of Aluminum Company of America, Alcoa, FY 1970 appears in the Wall Street Journal. The first figures shown are 1970-1969. Share earnings of $5.20, $5.58. The little a at the outset is explained in a footnote to refer to primary earnings, before special charges. There is much more footnote material. In fact, it occupies twice as much space as do the basic figures themselves. For the December quarter alone, the earnings per share are given as $1.58 in 1970 against $1.56 in 1969. The investor or speculator interested in Alcoa shares, reading those figures, might say to himself, not so bad. I knew that 1970 was a recession year in aluminium. But the fourth quarter shows a gain over 1969, with earnings at the rate of $6.32 per year. Let me see. The stock is selling at 62. Why, that's less than 10 times earnings. That makes it look pretty cheap, compared with 16 times for International Nickel, etc., etc. But if our investor speculator friend had bothered to read all the material in the footnote, he would have found that instead of one figure of earnings per share for the year 1970 there were actually four, viz. 1970-1969. Primary earnings $5.20, $5.58. Net income, after special charges, 4.32 5.58. Fully diluted, before special charges 5.01 5.35. Fully diluted, after special charges 4.19 5.35. For the fourth quarter alone only two figures are given. Primary earnings $1.58, $1.56. Net income, after special charges 0.701 0.56. What do all these additional earnings mean? Which earnings are true earnings for the year and the December quarter? If the latter should be taken at 70 cents, the net income after special charges, the annual rate would be $2.80 instead of $6.32, and the price 62 would be 22 times earnings, instead of the 10 times we started with. Part of the question as to the true earnings of Alcoa can be answered quite easily. The reduction from $5.20 to $5.01, to allow for the effects of dilution, is clearly called for. Alcoa has a large bond issue convertible into common stock, to calculate the earning power of the common, based on the 1970 results. It must be assumed that the conversion privilege will be exercised if it should prove profitable to the bondholders to do so. The amount involved in the Alcoa picture is relatively small, and hardly deserves detailed comment. But in other cases, making allowance for conversion rights, and the existence of stock purchase warrants, can reduce the apparent earnings by half, or more. We shall present examples of a really significant dilution factor below, page 411. The financial services are not always consistent in their allowance for the dilution factor in their reporting and analyses. Let us turn now to the matter of special charges. This figure of $18,800,000, or 88 cents per share, deducted in the fourth quarter, is not unimportant. Is it to be ignored entirely, or fully recognized as an earnings reduction, or partly recognized and partly ignored? The alert investor might ask himself also, how does it happen that there was a virtual epidemic of such special charge-offs appearing after the close of 1970, but not in previous years? Could there possibly have been some fine Italian hands at work with the accounting, but always, of course, within the limits of the permissible? When we look closely we may find that such losses, charged off before they actually occur, can be charmed away, as it were, with no unhappy effect on either past or future primary earnings. In some extreme cases they might be availed of to make subsequent earnings appear nearly twice as large as in reality, by a more or less prestidigitous treatment of the tax credit involved. In dealing with Alcoa's special charges, the first thing to establish is how they arose. The footnotes are specific enough. The deductions came from four sources, viz. 1. Management's estimate of the anticipated costs of closing down the manufactured products division. 2. Ditto for closing down Alcoa Castings Co.'s plants. 3. Ditto for losses in phasing out Alcoa Credit Company. 4. Also, estimated costs of $5.3 million associated with compulsion of the contract for a curtain wall. All of these items are related to future costs and losses. It is easy to say that they are not part of the regular operating results of 1970, but if so, where do they belong? Are they so extraordinary and non-recurring as to belong nowhere? A widespread enterprise such as Alcoa, doing a $1.5 billion business annually, must have a lot of divisions, departments, affiliates, and the like. Would it not be normal rather than extraordinary for one or more to prove unprofitable, and to require closing down? Similarly for such things as a contract to build a wall. Suppose that any time a company had a loss on any part of its business, it had the bright idea of charging it off as a special item, and thus reporting its primary earnings per share so as to include only its profitable contracts and operations. Like King Edward VII's sundial, that marked only the sunny hours. The king probably took his inspiration from a once famous essay by the English writer William Hazlitt, who mused about a sundial near Venice that bore the words horas non numero nisi serenas, or I count only the hours that are serene. Companies that chronically exclude bad news from their financial results on the pretext that negative events are extraordinary or non-recurring are taking a page from Hazlitt, who urged his readers to take no note of time but by its benefits, to watch only for the smiles and neglect the frowns of fate, to compose our lives of bright and gentle moments, turning away to the sunny side of things, and letting the rest slip from our imaginations, unheeded or forgotten. William Hazlitt, On a Sundial, ca. 1827. Unfortunately, investors must always count the sunny and dark hours alike. The reader should note two ingenious aspects of the Alcoa procedure we have been discussing. The first is that by anticipating future losses, the company escapes the necessity of allocating the losses themselves to an identifiable year. They don't belong in 1970, because they were not actually taken in that year. And they won't be shown in the year when they are actually taken, because they have already been provided for. Neat work, but might it not be just a little misleading? The Alcoa footnote says nothing about the future tax saving from these losses. Most other statements of this sort state specifically that only the after-tax effect has been charged off. If the Alcoa figure represents future losses before the related tax credit, then not only will future earnings be freed from the weight of these charges, as they are actually incurred, but they will be increased by a tax credit of some 50% thereof. It is difficult to believe that the accounts will be handled that way. But it is a fact that certain companies which have had large losses in the past have been able to report future earnings without charging the normal taxes against them. In that way making a very fine profits appearance indeed, based paradoxically enough on their past disgraces. Tax credits resulting from past years' losses are now being shown separately as special items, but they will enter into future statistics as part of the final net income figure. However, a reserve now set up for future losses, if net of expected tax credit, should not create an addition of this sort to the net income of later years. The other ingenious feature is the use by Alcoa and many other companies of the 1970 year-end for making these special charge-offs. The stock market took what appeared to be a bloodbath in the first half of 1970. Everyone expected relatively poor results for the year for most companies. Wall Street was now anticipating better results in 1971, 1972, etc. What a nice arrangement, then, to charge as much as possible to the bad year, which had already been written off mentally and had virtually receded into the past, leaving the way clear for nicely fattened figures in the next few years. Perhaps this is good accounting, good business policy, and good for management-shareholder relationships. But we have lingering doubts. The combination of widely, or should it be wildly, diversified operations with the impulse to clean house at the end of 1970 has produced some strange-looking footnotes to the annual reports. The reader may be amused by the following explanation given by a New York Stock Exchange company, which shall remain unnamed, of its special items aggregating $2,357,000, or about a third of the income before charge-offs. Consists of provision for closing Spalding United Kingdom operations, provision for reorganizational expenses of a division, costs of selling a small baby pants and bib manufacturing company, disposing of part interest in a Spanish car leasing facility, and liquidation of a ski boot operation. Years ago the strong companies used to set up contingency reserves out of the profits of good years to absorb some of the bad effects of depression years to come. The underlying idea was to equalize the reported earnings, more or less, and to improve the stability factor in the company's record. A worthy motive, it would seem, but the accountants quite rightly objected to the practice as misstating the true earnings. They insisted that each year's results be presented as they were, good or bad, and the shareholders and analysts be allowed to do the averaging or equalizing for themselves. We seem now to be witnessing the opposite phenomenon, with everyone charging off as much as possible against forgotten 1970, so as to start 1971 with a slate not only clean but specially prepared to show pleasing per share figures in the coming years. It is time to return to our first question. What then were the true earnings of Alcoa in 1970? The accurate answer would be the $5.01 per share, after dilution, less than part of the 82 cents of special charges that may properly be attributed to occurrences in 1970. But we do not know what that portion is, and hence we cannot properly state the true earnings for the year. The management and the auditors should have given us their best judgment on this point, but they did not do so. And furthermore, the management and the auditors should have provided for deduction of the balance of these charges from the ordinary earnings of a suitable number of future years, say, not more than 5. This evidently they will not do either, since they have already conveniently disposed of the entire sum as a 1970 special charge. The more seriously investors take the per share earnings figures as published, the more necessary it is for them to be on their guard against accounting factors of one kind and another that may impair the true comparability of the numbers. We have mentioned 3 sorts of these factors: the use of special charges, which may never be reflected in the per share earnings, the reduction in the normal income tax deduction by reason of past losses, and the dilution factor implicit in the existence of substantial amounts of convertible securities or warrants. One, a fourth item that has had a significant effect on reported earnings in the past is the method of treating depreciation, chiefly as between the straight line and the accelerated schedules. We refrain from details here, but as an example current as we write, let us mention the 1970 report of Tran Company. This firm showed an increase of nearly 20% in per share earnings over 1969, $3.29 versus $2.76, but half of this came from returning to the older straight-line depreciation rates, less burdensome on earnings than the accelerated method used the year before. The company will continue to use the accelerated rate on its income tax return, thus deferring income tax payments on the difference. Still another factor, important at times, is the choice between charging off research and development costs in the year they are incurred or amortizing them over a period of years. Finally, let us mention the choice between the FIFO, first in first out, and LIFO, last in first out, methods of valuing inventories. An obvious remark here would be that investors should not pay any attention to these accounting variables if the amounts involved are relatively small. But Wall Street being as it is, even items quite minor in themselves can be taken seriously. 2 days before the Alcoa report appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the paper had quite a discussion of the corresponding statement of Dow Chemical California. It closed with the observation that many analysts had been troubled by the fact that Dow had included a 21-cent item in regular profits for 1969, instead of treating it as an item of extraordinary income. Why the fuss? Because, evidently, evaluations of Dow Chemical involving many millions of dollars in the aggregate seemed to depend on exactly what was the percentage gain for 1969 over 1968, in this case either 9% or 41/2%. This strikes us as rather absurd. It is very unlikely that small differences involved in one year's results could have any bearing on future average profits or growth, and on a conservative, realistic valuation of the enterprise. By contrast, consider another statement also appearing in January 1971. This concerned Northwest Industries Incorporated's report for 1970. The company was planning to write off, as a special charge, not less than $264 million in one fell swoop. Of this, $200 million represents the loss to be taken on the proposed sale of the railroad subsidiary to its employees, and the balance a write-down of a recent stock purchase. These sums would work out to a loss of about $35 per share of common before dilution offsets, or twice its then current market price. Here we have something really significant. If the transaction goes through, and if the tax laws are not changed, this loss provided for in 1970 will permit Northwest Industries to realize about $400 million of future profits, within 5 years, from its other diversified interests without paying income tax thereon. What will then be the real earnings of that enterprise, should they be calculated with or without provision for the nearly 50% in income taxes which it will not actually have to pay? In our opinion, the proper mode of calculation would be first to consider the indicated earning power on the basis of full income tax liability, and to derive some broad idea of the stock's value based on that estimate. To this should be added some bonus figure, representing the value per share of the important but temporary tax exemption the company will enjoy. Allowance must be made, also, for a possible large-scale dilution in this case. Actually, the convertible preferred issues and warrants would more than double the outstanding common shares if the privileges are exercised. All this may be confusing and wearisome to our readers, but it belongs in our story. Corporate accounting is often tricky, security analysis can be complicated, stock valuations are really dependable only in exceptional cases. For most investors it would be probably best to assure themselves that they are getting good value for the prices they pay, and let it go at that. Use of average earnings. In former times analysts and investors paid considerable attention to the average earnings over a fairly long period in the past, usually from 7 to 10 years. This mean figure was useful for ironing out the frequent ups and downs of the business cycle, and it was thought to give a better idea of the company's earning power than the results of the latest year alone. One important advantage of such an averaging process is that it will solve the problem of what to do about nearly all the special charges and credits. They should be included in the average earnings. For certainly most of these losses and gains represent a part of the company's operating history. If we do this for Alcoa, the average earnings for 1961 to 1970, 10 years, would appear as $3.62, and for the 7 years 1964 to 1970 as $4.62 per share. If such figures are used in conjunction with ratings for growth and stability of earnings during the same period, they could give a really informing picture of the company's past performance. Calculation of the past growth rate. It is of prime importance that the growth factor in a company's record be taken adequately into account. Where the growth has been large, the recent earnings will be well above the 7 or 10-year average, and analysts may deem these long-term figures irrelevant. This need not be the case. The earnings can be given in terms both of the average and the latest figure. We suggest that the growth rate itself be calculated by comparing the average of the last 3 years with corresponding figures 10 years earlier. Where there is a problem of special charges or credits, it may be dealt with on some compromise basis. Note the following calculation for the growth of Alcoa as against that of Sears Roebuck and the Dow Jones Industrial Average Group as a whole. Comment: these few figures could be made the subject of a long discussion. They probably show as well as any others, derived by elaborate mathematical treatment, the actual growth of earnings. For the long period 1958 to 1970. But how relevant is this figure, generally considered central in common stock valuations, to the case of Alcoa? Its past growth rate was excellent, actually a bit